Seeing the effect, he planned to repeat this performance all the way down the line a few days later. Operation 1 was divided into two parts. The first effort was to knock out the assembled American air power at Guadalcanal, and the second effort would be made against New Guinea. On the morning of April 7, the Japanese mounted a major air attack on Guadalcanal. First, they sent hundreds of fighters and bombers down to the staging fields in the central Solomons. High-flying American reconnaissance planes that morning took pictures of 114 planes at Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. Another 100 were located at Balale. More planes were staging into the airfields at Buka, Vila on Kolombangara, and Munda on New Georgia. A total of 170 planes were assembled on the field at Rabaul and ready to go. Among these were planes of the 204th Naval Air Group at Rabaul. It was a measure of the importance headquarters put on this operation that this first mission of Operation Y was led by Captain Miyano himself. Everyone at the airfield knew what was happening, and excitement filled the air that morning. Some of the ground crews had worked all night to get the planes ready. The air crews had arisen at 3 o'clock in the morning and put on the new underwear issued the pilots when they went into battle. They had eaten hastily and assembled at the operations hut for briefing on the weather and enemy dispositions, and for final instructions, but no instructions were needed, really. The officers and men were primed to the point of fearlessness for this major effort. They knew it would be costly in terms of pilots and planes. Many of the pilots had written last letters home and included hair and fingernail clippings, which would forever symbolize their presence within the family. Among these was Captain Miyano, who did not expect to come back. As the flyers of the 204th got ready to man their planes, a message from headquarters reached the field. Reconnaissance planes flying over Guadalcanal just after dawn reported that the Americans had amassed a force of 5 heavy cruisers, 10 destroyers, and 10 transports at Guadalcanal. When the pilots heard this, they cheered, and they picked up the new white scarves they had all been issued that morning and headed for their planes. And everyone knew it was more than a normal mission. The sides of the field were lined with base personnel again, and again Admiral Yamamoto was there, in spotless, starched white uniform, standing quietly on the sideline, watching. His presence aroused in the young men a determination born of the military system, which imbued all soldiers and sailors with one thought above others. Every man's life belonged to emperor and country, and it was an honour above all others to die in battle. Their hearts were filled with resolution to see their great chief standing there, said one squadron member. The take-off that morning was just like all the others of the past, except in number of planes. The weather was closing in, grey sky above, and a rain squall hit the field as the first planes began taxiing along the apron. Everyone was anxious to get off, and now the pilots hurried even more. Captain Miyano had not said much before he climbed into his Zero. His plane handlers noticed that when he got into the cockpit and adjusted his instruments, he did not, as he usually did, pull on the parachute harness. He ignored it, and no one said anything. One by one the planes took off, the Zeros first, and they formed up over the field and circled as the slower bombers got going. It was 6 o'clock when all the planes were in the air and ready to head for the battle zone. The roar of engines was deafening, as one plane followed another off the ground. Then, suddenly, the field was quiet, except for the drone of engines up above. The men lining the runway began to drift away in little groups. One lonely figure stood to the last, waving as the planes went out of sight. Admiral Yamamoto. Over Rabaul, the Zeros circled, and 18 of them peeled off to head for Buin to pick up a force of dive bombers. The remainder moved down toward Buka, where they would refuel before going on to Guadalcanal. They landed at Buka at about 9 o'clock and waited while the ground crews refueled the planes. The 253rd Air Group was doing the same, and at a little before 10 o'clock, the 204th was ready to go again, and 52 Zeros took off and headed toward Guadalcanal. It was a long way, 500 miles. The 204th and the 253rd kept together at high altitude. Indeed, they were flying at very high altitude, 15,000 feet, to avoid detection before they reached their objective. An hour and a half out of Buka, they passed high over the oblong shape of Choiseul Island, a green and brown mass outlined against the blue of the ocean. From Choiseul on, The Japanese were in territory where they could expect Allied air opposition. The flight leaders began to keep an even warier eye turned around the horizon, lest they be jumped by American fighters. Just before 12:30 a.m., the 204th Group's planes reached the Russell Islands, and flak began to fly up at them. One or two planes were hit. They saw a small formation of enemy aircraft off to one side, going the other way. There was no way of getting to them. Admiral Yamamoto had arranged for the airmen to have some help from the submarine force. One I-boat was assigned to lie off Cape Esperance at the northwest corner of Guadalcanal Island and send radio signals that would guide the planes in on target. With the shortage of fuel that all the airmen felt, this was to be a big help. But the night before the attack, the submarine got involved in a fight with a destroyer and finally went up on a reef off Cape Esperance. The crew abandoned ship. All this was unknown to the High Command and to the airmen, and as they came in toward Guadalcanal expecting guidance, they heard nothing at all. Down south, at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the Americans were already getting information about the incoming attack. At noon, Allied coast watchers on New Georgia reported that the sky was grey with Japanese aircraft. Guadalcanal radio broadcast the warning of an impending air raid, largely for the benefit of the dozens of ships that stood in Lunga roads. Rear Admiral W.C. Ainsworth's cruiser task force was just weighing anchor, preparing to move north along the slot to bombard Munda again that night. With several hundred torpedo and dive bombers coming down the slot, Ainsworth decided that was no place to be, so he took his ships out toward Indispensable Strait and the safer waters to the south. But dozens of other ships still lay in the waters of Guadalcanal and Tulagi across Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese observation planes that morning had counted 14 transports as well as the task force, most of them on the Guadalcanal side. Across at Tulagi lay 15 PT boats and their tender, the Niagara, 7 small transports, 8 new landing craft tanks, the 14,500-ton tanker Kanawha, the tanker Erskine Phelps, 3 tugs, and several visiting New Zealand ships. Most of the ship captains got the message, but there was nothing they could do except wait for what might come, and they waited. From the fields of Guadalcanal, Admiral Mason was able to mount 76 fighter planes, and they orbited in small attack units in the Savo Island area to the north. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Radio Guadalcanal announced Condition Red, an air raid was coming. A few moments later, the announcer added his unofficial emphasis, Condition Very Red. It was not long before all concerned could see for themselves what he meant. The sky was filled with black dots, and scores of planes were boring in to attack. At Henderson Field, the operations office marshalled its forces. The American fighters were to concentrate on the Zeros, and they began peeling out of their orbits and heading in to attack the Japanese fighters. While they did so, the Japanese bombers headed straight for the ships in Iron Bottom Sound. The tanker Kanawha was most conspicuous down there on the water because she was throwing a white wake. She had just gotten underway, heading out toward Indispensable Strait, escorted by a patrol boat and the destroyer Taylor. 15 Aichi dive bombers came after her. They screamed down and dropped their 500-pound bombs. The bombs tore through the tanker's skin and started fires, and one bomb smashed into the engine room and put it completely out of commission. There was no chance of her moving further. In moments, the tanker was ablaze from one end to the other, and after 5 planes had bombed the tanker, the Japanese flight leader was so pleased with the results that he diverted the other 10 planes to hit other targets. The tanker seemed to be lost, the Taylor abandoned her, and the patrol boat stayed far off. Even the skipper of the Kanawha, Lieutenant Commander Brainerd Enbock, agreed with the Japanese flight leader, who had decided the Kanawha was finished. He ordered the ship abandoned. The engines were dead, but the ship was still sliding through the water, away from the trail of burning oil. Some men found rafts to push off the deck into the water, but the burning oil kept most of the men from getting near those makeshift lifeboats. Men went over the side and began to swim, and as the men of the Kanawha tried to save themselves, dozens of other bombers screamed in across Tulagi Harbour. The New Zealand corvette, Moa, was fueling from the Erskine Phelps that afternoon. As a result of a breakdown in Allied communications procedures, her radio was not tuned in to the Guadalcanal radio channel. She did not get the advance word of the impending air raid. The first her crew knew of it was at that moment, when the scream of the dive bombers assailed their ears. The Japanese were aiming for the tanker, but they hit the corvette and she went down in a few minutes. Fortunately, all but 5 men of the crew were saved. Other dive bombers attacked the tanker Tappahannock, which had been unloading aviation gasoline in Lunga Roads, but her skipper had heard and heeded the warning. He had cleared the area and was moving out of Lengo Channel when the dive bombers came in. She was escorted by the destroyer Woodworth. The Japanese attack on these ships was not very skillful, and the anti-aircraft gunners on the destroyer and ashore were effective. 7 dive bombers concentrated on the tanker, but she managed to avoid all the bombs. The destroyer Aaron Ward also came in for attack. One of the dive bombers put a bomb into her aft engine room, and 2 other near misses did more damage. She sank later in the day. The fighting was furious, and the Zeros did their job almost perfectly, keeping the American fighters engaged so that most of them never had a chance to go after a dive bomber. When it ended, the flyers of both sides returned to their bases to make exaggerated claims about their victories. The Americans claimed a total of more than 100 planes shot down. Officially, pilots and anti-aircraft gunners together were credited by their own authorities with shooting down 27 Zeros and a dozen dive bombers. The Japanese denied that so many of their fighters had fallen. They admitted to the loss of only 9, although Japanese figures agreed with those of the Americans on the 12 bombers. The Japanese flyers were just as prone as were the Americans to exaggeration. Their pilots came home to claim the sinking of a United States cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 transports, and 31 American fighter planes. The American figures showed 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, and 1 tanker sunk, and 7 marine fighter planes lost. As for the tanker Kanawha, as the battle faded, the tugs Menominee and Rail, 2 landing craft tanks, and a minesweeper came out to rescue the survivors. They picked up all but 19 men, and as the flames died down a little, the navigator. Lieutenant C.W. Brockway gathered a group of volunteers from the Rail, and they boarded the burning tanker and got the fires out. The Rail towed the tanker to the west side of Tulagi and beached her. It seemed that she might be salvaged, but the Japanese bombers had done their work well. Even though the fires were out, the tanker was taking water and dropping down by the stern. During the night, her aft end filled to the point that the bow popped up, and she slid off the bank and sank in Iron Bottom Sound. Having had his swipe at Guadalcanal, Admiral Yamamoto was now obligated to serve the Army's ends by taking his next attack to New Guinea, where the United States 5th Air Force was operating. The first strike was made against Oro Bay because observation planes had reported the presence of a dozen ships. The Japanese came in silently, and the Allies had only 5 minutes' warning. The bombers sank 1 freighter, put another up on the beach as a wreck, and damaged an Australian minesweeper. They lost 6 planes in the fight. On April 12, the Japanese from Rabaul again hit New Guinea, Port Moresby this time. A force of 175 planes made the attack. Once again, the Zeros did their job admirably, engaging the Allied fighters so their bombers could get through. But the pilots looked down on the shipping and found an unimpressive collection. Only a few small craft were in the harbour that day, so the big effort was largely wasted. The Japanese were back on April 14, this time to hit Milne Bay, where the observation planes had reported the presence of 14 transports. But by the time the Japanese attack arrived, all except 4 of the transports had cleared. This time nearly 190 planes came in from Rabaul. The bombers again did their work. They sank 1 Dutch ship that was carrying ammunition and gasoline and damaged another. They damaged a British motor ship and shot up the airstrip near the town, setting off a fire in a fuel dump. Only 7 planes were lost in the raid, and the Japanese came back as usual, full of stories. Rabaul headquarters sent the word to Admiral Yamamoto that his Operation Y had cost the enemy 1 cruiser, 3 destroyers, and more than 24 transports, plus 175 Allied planes. Believing all that was true, which it was not, the Japanese considered the operation a success. Admiral Yamamoto called a halt to the bombing, and the carrier planes were ordered back to their carriers. So Operation 1 came to an end and was officially declared by the Japanese to have accomplished all it set out to do. In the light of the events of the next few months, it seems to have been a waste of Japanese talent, although the losses were not particularly high on either side. If Yamamoto wanted to go to all the trouble of staging a special operation, then why did he break it off so suddenly, before it had accomplished what he wanted? One reason was not known to the Americans at that moment. The naval aircraft shortage in the South Pacific would not permit much more. The 204th Air Group, for example, suffered a steady attrition of planes, and its commander kept hounding 11th Air Fleet for more. But there were no more, and as it soon became painfully apparent to all, there were not enough planes on hand to accomplish the missions planned. A commander would ask for 20 planes and get 6. He would complain about the 6 and say that was not enough to fly a mission protecting bombers, and the answer was that it would have to be enough. That was the way the war was going in the South, and the airmen were the first to know that it was not good enough. But, as they discovered if they hounded higher authority long enough, there was absolutely nothing to be done about it. It was 9 months since the Battle of Midway had been won by the Americans because they were able to break the Japanese naval codes. The Japanese still did not know that the enemy could read their most secret communications. The Japanese returning from Midway had suggested that the enemy must have had some advance knowledge, and suspicion was directed at the code, but Imperial General Headquarters would not believe it. That code, like the German secret codes, depended on a complicated code machine. The developers swore that it was impossible to break the code, and Imperial Headquarters was satisfied. So the American radio intelligence teams continued to draw enormous advantage from the fact that they could tell what the Japanese were going to do and when. Intelligence alone did not win battles, but it certainly helped. The radio intelligence section of naval intelligence at Pearl Harbor worked diligently, particularly with the submarine service, to give out operational information and yet try to preserve the closely guarded secret of the source of information. So far their efforts had been successful, but the maintenance of the secret was one of the big problems for the command, since use could not be made of the material without sometimes threatening to compromise the source. The intelligence men were careful and lucky, and as of the spring of 1943, neither Admiral Yamamoto nor the High Command in Tokyo had the slightest inkling that the naval code was not secure. Thus, on April 14, when Yamamoto planned another frontline tour to bolster morale of the airmen in the South Pacific, Combined Fleet Headquarters had no hesitation in sending the information and Yamamoto's itinerary to all the bases and commands involved in messages using the secret naval code. The message was received at Shortlands, Buin and Balale, giving the time of the Admiral's departure from the main naval airbase at Rabaul and the time and manner of his return. The message was also received by a United States Navy radioman at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, whose monotonous job it was to monitor Japanese radio traffic. The radioman did not know what he was taking down, but he did know that all Japanese naval traffic was to be relayed to naval intelligence offices in Washington and in Pearl Harbor. When the message about the Yamamoto trip was decoded, it created unusual activity in both commands. At Pearl Harbor, Commander Edward T. Layton, the Pacific Fleet intelligence officer, discussed the possibility of assassinating the Japanese commander and concluded that the idea was sound. The radio intelligence team was worried because it seemed likely that if an attempt was made on Yamamoto at this time, the Japanese would draw the conclusion that their communications had been breached, but theirs was not the decision. The yes or no rested in Washington, and here the information came first to Naval Intelligence Deputy Chief Captain Ellis Zacharias. Soon many top officials were in on the secret, and most of them seemed to agree that the assassination was very much in the United States' national interest. As the Japanese pointed out in their histories after the war, Yamamoto, although unknown to most Americans, was ranked by those in the know high on the list of Axis ringleaders. With the United States Navy, he was inscribed just after Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Tojo on the hate list. The reason for singling out Yamamoto for the honour was that he was regarded quite rightly as the architect of the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. When the unusual message was received, several officials saw the opportunity for revenge. Indeed, the Japanese term for the whole affair was fukushusaku, revenge military operation. That motivation certainly possessed America in general, and the politicians in particular. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox pushed the matter, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt liked the idea. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz, with his cool engineer's mind, considered the matter in a different manner. Yamamoto was a professional naval officer, just as Nimitz was, and under other circumstances the shoe might be on the other foot. What could such a move accomplish? Was it worth the obvious danger of compromising the ultra-secret, the knowledge of the Japanese code? In the end, he decided it was. Nimitz sent a message to Admiral Halsey at Noumea, saying that if Halsey thought he could manage the assassination, he was authorized to begin preliminary planning. That last phrase indicated that the final decision would be made at a higher level, and Halsey had to be prepared to abandon the plan if the decision was negative. The war was an extremely personal matter to Admiral Halsey. Since the Pearl Harbor attack, he had hated all Japanese with a hearty passion, and Admiral Yamamoto was third on his personal bad list. When the message arrived at Noumea, Halsey was in Australia on a flying trip, conferring with General MacArthur about future operations in the South and Southwest Pacific. The Admiral's staff, however, knew the Admiral's mind, and in short order the message was sent on to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, the new commander of land-based aircraft in the Solomons. Admiral Mitcher, like Admiral Halsey, was an aggressive fighter. He did not hesitate to accept the challenge, nor did he concern himself with the possible repercussions on the ultra-secret of such an assassination. These matters were for higher authority. Within a matter of hours he had conferred with his staff, plotted the possibilities, and returned a message saying that it could be done. When Admiral Halsey returned to Noumea, he was delighted to learn of the plans. He referred to Yamamoto as the Peacock because of the Japanese admiral's enormous dignity and his habit of appearing in public only in full-dress uniform, complete with gloves and a ceremonial sword. Halsey's feelings about Yamamoto were perhaps more personal than those against the others. He knew the Japanese admiral from the old days when he had visited Japan as a junior officer with the Great White Fleet that President Theodore Roosevelt had sent around the world. Halsey took the unannounced Pearl Harbor attack as a personal affront, and not long after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had been quoted in neutral countries as saying he was looking forward to dictating peace in the White House. Rather, Yamamoto was misquoted. What he had said was that the sort of peace he was being asked about by the reporter could only be dictated at the White House, and what he had meant was that only the President of the United States could stop the war. In fact, Yamamoto, alone among the Japanese leaders, had opposed war with the United States until Japanese and American policies had made it inevitable. Still, although the wheels were in motion, the matter was not decided, and in Washington, Captain Zacharias vigorously advocated the assassination. The Japanese Navy, he said, could claim no other figure so beloved by the men of the fleet and the general public. And speaking technically, there was no other in the Japanese Navy with the flair and dash of Yamamoto. On a military level, said Zacharias, the assassination attempt was as much worthwhile as it was on a political level. But the decision was still not yet made, and there was only one man who could make it, President Roosevelt. It was one thing to advocate the assassination in principle, and quite another to learn that it was feasible and then put the official stamp on it. Viewed from hindsight, the decision was anything but chivalrous, but chivalry had no place in World War II. With the outbreak of war, the United States had for the first time joined the advocates of unrestricted submarine warfare. Atrocities had been committed from the beginning by the Japanese in the death marches in the newly captured countries, the beheading of airmen shot down over Japan in the Doolittle raid, and most recently the torture and murder of European civilians in the Solomons. The Americans had responded in like manner, and the no-quarter character of the war was well established. President Roosevelt approved the assassination, and when the message went from Washington to Pearl Harbor to Noumea, it bore the signature of Secretary Frank Knox, so in a matter of hours the assassination was on. Admiral Halsey was informed that the matter was cleared. He sent a message to Admiral Mitcher. Nimitz had asked Halsey if he could make such an interception so far away, because even 3 months earlier Halsey would not have had the resources to do the job. But those resources had recently become available in the increased number of P-38 long-range fighter interceptor planes in the South Pacific. A number of them had come up to Guadalcanal for the 339th Army Air Force Fighter Squadron. These planes were most effective against the Zeros, making up in speed, altitude tolerance, and diving potential for the superior turning capacity of the Zero. By spring, the Zero pilots had learned to respect the P-38 above all American fighters, and for good reason. An only moderately skillful P-38 pilot in his superior plane could face up to Japan's best in their unarmored Zeros and have at least an even chance. For a mission such as the one outlined by Admiral Mitcher for the Army Air Force pilots, the P-38 was the ideal plane. The attempt on Yamamoto would be a matter of split-second timing. He would probably be travelling with members of his staff in a Mitsubishi Zero Betty twin-engine bomber. The bomber was to be ambushed and shot down at one of the bases as it was preparing to land. The point of the mission was to get in, shoot fast, and get out. It would be the epitome of what the Japanese called a damashiuchi, sneak attack. Thus, within a matter of 2 days from the interception of the message bearing the Yamamoto itinerary, the military authorities of the United States had discussed the matter thoroughly at every level. Given the resources, there was nothing to stop the operation, and the question of the security of the codebreakers was generally disregarded at the political level where the decision was finally made. The green light was on, and when the codebreakers intercepted still another message reaffirming the Japanese plans and timing. Admiral Halsey sent a radio message in his own vigorous style to Admiral Mitcher. It appears the Peacock will be on time, fan his tail. At dawn on April 18, at the Japanese airbase at Rabaul, all was ready for Admiral Yamamoto's one-day inspection flight. For several days, various members of his staff and subordinate commands had tried to persuade the Admiral that it was not necessary for him to make this trip just now, and that it was dangerous. One of his officers had even suggested that the Americans might very well find out somehow about the trip and make a special effort to knock him out. As they all knew, the Japanese no longer controlled the airspace above the South Pacific Islands. Even their own bases were subject to bombing attack. Yamamoto, however, would not be dissuaded. The Japanese in forward bases of the islands had suffered too many reverses recently, and they were receiving too little support from home. Whatever he could do to bolster morale was worth the effort. The commander of the airbase at Rabaul had laid on 20 Zero fighters to escort the Admiral's plane on the trip, but Yamamoto had refused to accept so much protection. It was not necessary, he said. Those planes were better used escorting bombers or waiting to destroy American attack planes. He insisted that no more than 6 Zeros accompany the mission. Just before 6 o'clock on the morning of April 18, Tokyo time, the travelling party assembled at the Rabaul's eastern airfield for the takeoff. Yamamoto would ride in one of the attack bombers of the 705th Bombardment Squadron. His plane and Admiral Ugaki's were piloted by experienced flyers. 6 Zeros of the 309th Fighter Squadron comprised the escort. A few minutes after the Admiral's party arrived on the field they were aboard and the engines were turning. Admiral Yamamoto's plane took off first, heading out over the east end of the bay above the volcanoes. Ugaki's plane was next, and then the pilots moved into formation. The Zeros took off and joined them. They climbed to 4,500 feet, and 2 of the fighters moved up ahead and above the formation. 2 more fighters covered Admiral Ugaki's plane, and 2 protected the rear, and the formation turned and took a course southeast toward Bougainville. Admiral Yamamoto moved up to the front of his plane and took over the pilot's seat. Admiral Yamamoto's subordinates were efficient. His party was precisely following the itinerary established for him. 6 o'clock takeoff had been made as announced. The first stop would be Balale, where they were to arrive at 8 a.m. Tokyo time and spend just enough time for the Admiral to address his fighting men. The pilots tightened up the formation as they moved out to sea and up to 5,000 feet altitude. A little scattered cloud appeared, but visibility was excellent, and as Admiral Ugaki noted in his diary, flying conditions could not have been better. The pilots were a little nervous with so much responsibility, and they tightened the formation until the planes were flying wing to wing with the tips nearly touching. They passed over the northern tip of Bougainville, and then below they could see the base at Buka. They went on without incident. When they neared Balale, they were particularly careful because that airfield was perched on the edge of the jungle, and one false move would send a plane spiralling into the thick mass of trees and creepers. But all of these pilots were experienced flyers, and they had made the trip so many times it almost seemed like a milk run. Since the Admiral was expected by 9:30 a.m. United States time, which was 8 a.m. Japanese time, all the base personnel were lined up along the runway. From the commander on down, they waited, watching for the planes. Aboard the lead bomber, the pilot sent back a message for the Admiral. They were ahead of schedule, and they would arrive at Balale at 7:45 a.m. Immediately after the Admiral had said a few words to the assembled troops, they would head for the harbour, and the sub-chaser that had been laid on for the Admiral's trip to the Shortlands. There was no question about going down there by plane. Shortlands was the site of a destroyer and seaplane base. It was virtually on the edge of the combat zone, and any movement by air might be expected to bring about an American air attack, and it wasn't certain, but it was too great a possibility to ignore. By 9:45 a.m., the Admiral would have spoken to the men of the Shortlands bases, and he would be ready to board his ship again and speed for Balale. At 11 a.m., he would board his bomber again, and escorted by the 6 Zeros, would make the 10-minute flight to Boin, where he would lunch with the assembled officers of the Naval Command and Naval Air Command. At 1 p.m. he would be in the air again, on his way back to Rabaul, and would arrive at 3:40 p.m. United States time. The result of this busy day, Admiral Yamamoto knew from experience, would be to put new life into his frontline defenders. Despite the doleful warnings of his colleagues, Yamamoto knew that at this time morale was the most important asset his command could have, and so he had never wavered in his insistence on making the dangerous trip. The air flight down had been so uneventful that even the worried Admiral Ugaki had relaxed. He had written in his diary and napped until warned by the crew of his bomber that they were approaching landing. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal at 7 a.m. or 5 a.m. Japanese time, Admiral Mitscher was sitting in his jeep on the apron of the runway as 18 P-38 pilots came trooping down to the flight line and climbed aboard their planes. The American takeoff to intercept Admiral Yamamoto's flight just before it landed at Balale had to be earlier than the Japanese takeoff from Rabaul because the distance was greater. For the American effort, Mitscher had chosen the 339th Army Air Force Fighter Squadron because he had come to respect that unit's abilities in the 2 weeks since he had come to take over command of the land-based air forces in the Solomons. These fighter pilots knew their business, and their record against the recent Japanese air raids showed it. Also, the P-38 almost seemed to have been built for just such a job as the interception of Admiral Yamamoto's flight. The problem, from the moment that Mitscher had Halsey's message about the Yamamoto trip, was to figure out how many planes to send, what opposition they might expect, and how they were going to get to Bougainville and back, a straight-line round trip of about 650 miles. It meant that someone was going to have to do extremely accurate dead reckoning navigation, and that auxiliary gasoline tanks would have to be brought in for the P-38s. They were not normally used by fighter planes at Guadalcanal at this time, because of the short range of most missions and the added danger of fire. It also meant flying down on the deck most of the way, to avoid detection by Japanese radar. That requirement made the mission even more difficult. The P-38 was designed for high altitude, and down on the deck the engines consumed 3 times as much fuel. Some of the pilots might have to ditch on the way home. When the preliminary plans had been made, Major John W. Mitchell, the commanding officer of the 339th, had been called in and given the assignment. Admiral Mitscher had particularly asked that 4 specified pilots be sent on the mission. They were Captains Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber, and Lieutenants Joseph Moore and James McClanahan. They had performed very well in the big Japanese raid of Operation 1 on April 7, claiming a total of 7 Japanese planes shot down. On that same day, the Marines, flying Wildcat and Corsair fighters, had lost 7 planes to the Zeros. The outcome of that air battle, then, had showed the superiority of the P-38 and the excellence of this particular group of pilots. The planners at Henderson Field had worked meticulously, even to the point of anticipating that Yamamoto's plane would arrive at Balale 15 minutes early, because on the morning of April 18, the usual southeast wind would not be blowing, so they would have no headwinds to buck. The Americans decided to use 18 planes, even though they had no knowledge of the size of the Japanese force of Zeros that would be covering Yamamoto, and had to assume that they would run the danger of being jumped by all of the 100 Army Zeros based on Bougainville, but only 18 P-38s were available. Other fighters could come along and cover the rear, but their value would be to stop a chase by Zeros after the fact. They couldn't keep up with the P-38s, nor could the P-38s slow down for their companions. Major Mitchell, figuring his logistics, estimated that if they flew at optimum speed, they would have about 5 minutes in the target zone before fuel became critical. The route he planned made the trip a third longer, and to avoid detection he would bypass the New Georgia group and fly out of sight of land. The distance then would be 400 more miles to the target, but the extra tanks should take care of that. The success of this mission depended on getting in and getting out in a hurry. Just a few hours before the mission was to begin, Major Mitchell learned from a new intercepted message that the Japanese escort would be only 6 Zeros, but that did not mean the 100 Bougainville Zeros would not be primed to look for enemy incursion. At 7:10 p.m. United States time, Mitchell's P-38 took off, followed by the 3 others of his flight. Admiral Mitchell waved from his jeep as the planes passed the apron on their way to the runway. The next 4 planes were the shooters, led by Captain Lanphier, and on takeoff, McClanahan's plane blew a tire, and his flight was scrubbed. There was not a minute to wait for him. Now there were 17 P-38s. In the air, the planes circled until all had taken off, and the squadron joined up at 7:25 p.m. and headed west. Half an hour out, Moore's plane refused to respond to a switch to the drop tanks, and he had to turn back. Mitchell motioned 2 other pilots, Besby Holmes and Ray Hine, to move up to join Lanphier's flight. They would be the new shooters, and now the strike force was down to 16. The planes droned on, and Mitchell took them down on the deck. This was dangerous flying, and they learned how dangerous when one P-38 very nearly crashed into the sea. There was no way of controlling absolute height at high speed, and in the winds, some planes flew at 10 feet above the surface and some at 50. One fell so low that prop wash from the plane ahead drenched the windshield and blinded the pilot. He was lucky to be able to climb above the danger zone. They were so low, all 16 planes, that their propellers left wakes like those of powerboats, so low that the pilots could see big fish, including many sharks, swimming in the clear Pacific water. The whole flight was over water, far to the west of Kolombangara and New Georgia. Mitchell had chosen this course to avoid detection by Japanese coast watchers, who were just as effective as the Australians. At 8:20 p.m., Major Mitchell changed course, and half an hour later he changed course again. The planes passed around Vella Lavella Island and turned to the northeast, still right down on top of the water. By this time, with half an hour still to go, the pilots were growing restless. They had flown a long way without seeing anything but their own planes. The strain of keeping the planes so close to the water made them nervous. None of them had ever spent so much time out of sight of land before. Suddenly, the mist that had lain over the water cleared, and ahead of them they saw Bougainville. Mitchell made out the landmark. They had come in just southeast of Empress Augusta Bay, which had been his point of aim. They were 1 minute ahead of schedule, but where was Yamamoto? Lieutenant Douglas Canning was the first to see other aircraft, just off to the left and higher than they were. The Americans counted. There were the 6 fighters, as unwittingly advertised by the Japanese, but there also were 2, not 1 but 2, Betty bombers. Mitchell had not been prepared for this development. It seemed questionable that the 4 P-38s assigned the shooter's role could take on both bombers, but there was nothing else to be done. Mitchell turned to parallel the course of the Japanese and began to climb. It was time to drop the auxiliary tanks, which could now only impede maneuverability and increase the danger of fire and explosion. Mitchell dropped his. Several pilots had trouble with theirs, including Holmes, who moved out of formation and maneuvered his plane to try to shake the tanks loose. Hine joined him in the approved fashion to protect the other P-38. and so two of the shooters were out of position. Lanfear and Barber went on, heading out to intercept the Japanese formation. The Japanese flew on, not seeing anything out of the ordinary, until one pilot finally caught the silvery flash of jettisoned auxiliary tanks in the sky and shouted out the warning. The Zeros turned toward the enemy planes. Lanfear engaged one of them and shot it down. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's plane had turned sharply toward Buin and went down on the deck, just above the jungle tops. Admiral Ugaki's pilot turned the other way, out to sea. Barber was the first to attack. He saw one of the bombers ahead of him and opened fire. Pieces began flying off the unarmoured plane, and the Betty made a sharp turn to the left and then plunged toward the beach. Barber never saw it fall. He was too busy with 3 Zeros on his tail, until planes from the cover above got after them and scattered them. Lanfear, having tangled with 1 Zero, then went after the other bomber and nearly collided with a pair of Zeros that were trying to intercept him. He got behind the bomber and began to fire his guns. The right engine shot out a jet of flame and the wing tank caught fire. The bomber began to burn, the right wing came off, and the plane plunged into the jungle and exploded. The 2 Zero pilots then began to chase Lanfear, but he managed to get into a climb and to outdistance them with the twin engines. When he reached 20,000 feet and looked around, they were gone. Holmes finally cleared his auxiliary tanks, and he and Hine came in looking for the bombers. They saw one fall into the jungle, and another, chased by a lone P-38, which had 3 Zeros on its tail. They sped to the rescue and began firing at the Zeros. Holmes claimed to have shot down 2 of them, and then he too went after the second bomber, using his 20mm cannon and the 50 caliber machine guns. Admiral Ugaki's bomber jinked and weaved and tried to get away, and down below, at Kahili Airfield, every operational Zero was trying to get into the air to join the battle. From his vantage point inside, Admiral Ugaki watched the battle and saw the men in the plane dying as one of the P-38s laced the bomber with heavy fire. He did not realize that the P-38s were shooting cannon, but he did see that the 7.7mm guns of the Betty could not reach the P-38 while the fighter was working over the bomber. The men inside began to fall, the tail gunner, the crew chief, the waist gunners, and some of Yamamoto's staff. From above, the Americans saw the bomber disintegrate as it struck the water. But this was not quite the case. The pilot, seeing that he could not escape the P-38 that was after him, pushed the wheel down and opted to make a crash landing in the sea. The bomber began to fall, and as he neared the water, the pilot tried to pull out of the dive to pancake in, but the plane did not respond to the controls, and she struck at full speed. The left wing broke away, which lessened the impact in the fuselage and probably saved Ugaki's life. The plane rolled over to the left and began to sink. Admiral Ugaki was thrown out of his seat and scrambled up the aisle and out of the broken fuselage. Around him the sea blazed with burning gasoline, but he managed to avoid it. He looked around him. A boat was coming at high speed from the shore. The pilot and one other Yamamoto staff officer, Rear Admiral Kitamura, had also survived, and they were all rescued within a few minutes. Above, the Zeros from Kahili Airfield had begun taking off and gaining altitude to attack the American planes. Zeros got above Barber, Holmes, and Hine and started an attack. Barber and Holmes managed to get away, but Hine was shot down up above. Major Mitchell called his pilots to start home, and the whole action had taken less than 5 minutes, but time was short, as he knew it would be. He headed toward Guadalcanal, and the other P-38s turned. Several of them lost touch with the formation and straggled home by themselves. Major Mitchell brought his pilots home. Lanfear came in alone after several other planes had landed. He was scarcely out of his P-38 than he was shouting, "I got Yamamoto! I got Yamamoto!" Soon Barber was on the ground, making the same claim, and then along came Holmes, who landed first at the emergency field in the Russells. He told the whole story on the airstrip to a gang of Marines, and his version was that perhaps he had shot down the bomber carrying the Japanese Admiral. The whole affair became enormously confused, and the number of Zeros claimed by the pilots was far in excess of the 3 that had gone down. The combat intelligence officers finally straightened out the figures a little. The number of Zeros was reduced to 3, but they gave credit to Lanphier, Holmes and Barber for 1 bomber each. Since there were only 2 bombers involved, it was indeed confused. With the exception of the flyers involved, no one cared, and the fact was that there was a good chance that Yamamoto was dead. Mitcher so informed Halsey in a guarded message that referred obliquely to the Yamamoto plane. 2 bombers escorted by Zeros flying close formation, 1 shot down believed to be test flight. When that message was received at Halsey's headquarters, the joy was almost as unrestrained as it had been on Guadalcanal, when Admiral Mitcher had presented the Army pilots with a case of bourbon whiskey. Admiral Kelly Turner let out a war whoop. Halsey pretended it was nothing. "Hold on, Kelly, what's so good about it? I'd hoped to lead that bad guy up Pennsylvania Avenue in chains with the rest of you kicking him where it would do the most good." Then Halsey sent a message to Mitcher. "Congratulations to you and Major Mitchell and his hunters. Sounds as though one of the ducks in their bag was a peacock." There was nothing Halsey would have liked better than to announce the victory to the world. But what would happen if he did? During the day, a number of high-ranking officers in Washington, Pearl Harbor and Noumea began to have second thoughts. Simultaneously, several officers realized that there was no way the Americans could have known that Admiral Yamamoto was aboard one of those planes, except by intercepting a secret coded message. Halsey sent a rocket to Admiral Mitcher, warning him that the mission must be kept absolutely secret. For fear of compromising the code breakers, it was a little late. Newsreel cameramen on Guadalcanal had already taken hundreds of feet of film, and reporters had the story in their notebooks. All the film was confiscated, and the reporters were put on notice that their story was censored. Mitcher ordered the P-38s out again the next day to fly a routine mission over Buin just to show themselves, so the impression on the Japanese would be that the Americans had begun regular fighter sweeps in the area. It was the next day before the Japanese could launch a proper search into the jungle near Buin, and several hours later before the searchers came upon the wreckage of the bomber that had crashed there. The search was interrupted by those P-38s which swept overhead, coming in to strafe Kahili airfield, but in 10 minutes the planes were gone, and the search proceeded. The searchers found the plane and the bodies, and all aboard had been killed in the crash. Admiral Yamamoto had obviously been at the controls, and he had been thrown clear along with Admiral Takata of his staff. The bodies of the others in the plane had been badly burned by the fire, but Yamamoto's body was intact, and the white gloves and ceremonial sword he had brought with him on his last flight were there. The bodies were taken back by litter to the shore, and then by submarine chaser to Buin. There, on April 20, the body of Admiral Yamamoto was cremated with the others. The ashes were placed in little boxes and then taken to Rabaul. The flagship Musashi came down from Truk with a whole fleet behind it. The urn containing the Admiral's ashes was placed aboard in his Commander-in-Chief's quarters, along with those of the 6 staff officers killed with him. The fleet left for Truk, and after a short stop there they went on to Tokyo, and the shock reverberated through the South Pacific. Something had to be done about command, so Admiral Minechi Koga was appointed to be commander of the combined fleet, but it would not be the same. Japan had lost the great hero of the war. The military and the public were not told about the death of Yamamoto until the funeral fleet arrived in Tokyo Bay in May. Then Japan gave itself over to a period of mourning. Only a day or 2 after the event, Army and Navy headquarters at Rabaul sent messages to the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo, suggesting that the ambush could not have been accidental. The Americans must have broken the secret naval code, they said. But in Tokyo it was easy for the code experts to assert once again that it was totally impossible for the Americans to break the machine code. They would have to have a code machine of the same sort, on the same settings. There was no way this could have happened, said the Japanese experts. Everyone knew that there had never been a breach of security in this regard. So, although faced with the evidence and warned by the strongly expressed suspicions of the men in the field, Imperial General Headquarters refused to believe, and the Japanese codes remained as they were, the major weakness of the Imperial Navy throughout the Pacific War. When the deed was in the making, the Americans involved in the Yamamoto affair were warned to say nothing. The 17 living pilots who had been assigned to the mission were immediately grounded, sent back to Noumea, lectured by General Millard Harmon, commander of the 5th Air Force, and then sent back to the United States. At every step they were warned that if they said a word about the mission, they would be court-martialed. They got medals and promotions and were assigned to duty in the United States for the rest of the war. Everyone on Guadalcanal and in the Russells who knew anything about the mission was also threatened with the direst of fates if he breathed a word, yet the story got out. An Australian newspaper got hold of it and printed it, and it was also printed and broadcast widely in South America, so the Japanese knew that there had been a breach of security, but that arrogance in Tokyo continued. The Imperial General Staff heard the story and dismissed it as they had the complaints of the admirals and generals at Rabaul. The American secret was saved. Had the assassination been worth the risk? To be sure, Yamamoto was an important figure, and even the President of the United States had concurred in the affair. One might say that he had passed the death sentence. The irony is that of all the Japanese leaders, Yamamoto at that period in the war had the most realistic view of the future, and had the war continued to go as badly as it did go, it is conceivable that he could have had a hand in bringing it to an end earlier than August 1945. But also, as the death of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel also proved, the fact was that no individual in the war was indispensable, or worth the price of that broken code, and had the Japanese leaders in Tokyo recognized what had happened, the course of the war might have been changed. Certainly many ship movements would never have been reported to the submarines, and it is possible that some battles might have had a different result. In the end, the outcome would have been the same. There was no denying the effect of American production over the long haul. But had the fact of the broken code been accepted in Tokyo, many more Japanese lives might have been saved, and many more American lives lost. In authorizing the Yamamoto mission, the Americans had taken a chance that seems much more risky now than it seemed then in the euphoria of the moment. As it happened, it turned out all right for them. They were very, very lucky. Since the previous January, Admiral Halsey and General MacArthur had been building up their forces in preparation for the 1943 Allied offensives in the South and Southwest Pacific theatres. The military situation was almost the reverse of what it had been 6 months earlier, when the Japanese in the Solomons had controlled the air and the sea. Halsey's preparations included frequent strikes against the Japanese air bases on New Georgia and Kolombangara Islands from the air and by sea, using cruisers and destroyers. But the Japanese doggedly continued to supply their forward garrisons, in spite of frequent American air attacks. Except for the loss of the Minagumo and Murasame, the spring supply runs had been routine until March 29. That afternoon, Allied planes caught a 6-ship convoy at Rakata Bay and sank sub-chaser No. 28. The captain and 29 men were killed in the attack, and 2 days later, 3 Japanese destroyers visited the same spot without incident. They brought supplies and evacuated 25 men suffering from fever. That evening, the destroyers Samidare, Akigumo, Kazagumo, Yagumo, and Asagumo cleared Rabaul harbour and headed for the forward bases. At about 6:50 p.m., they were attacked by a large formation of enemy planes, and as darkness lowered, the planes dropped flares and began to attack all 5 ships. The destroyers scattered and took evasive action. The only ship hurt in all this action was the Samidare. A near miss damaged the riveting in the crew's compartment aft, and the area began to flood. Under the circumstances, the captain of the Samidare decided it was too risky to try to unload and perhaps have his ship sink under him. So he turned back toward the Shortlands, but returned to Kolombangara and unloaded his supplies and troops without further incident. Since in March, General Imamura, the commander of the 8th Area Army, had ordered the reinforcement of the Central Solomons bases. Several battalions of infantry, field artillery, and specialist troops were sent down, along with field hospitals and more radio installations. The last 10 days of April were the period of the dark of the moon, and the Japanese used these days to good advantage in their resupply program.